We can't hear you all.
Can you hear us? Okay.
Let's try it now.
Can you hear us now?
That works
Okay.
now. Perfect.
Small
I have to remind the clerk.
technical problem on this end.
Loose nut at the clerk's desk.
Yeah, we're losing it. Sorry.
Good morning. Welcome.
Good morning.
So I guess just an update on where we're at with the land use plan.
Sounds good. Well, so we, as Commissioner Overfield and Commissioner Teal can attest, well, you all met yesterday morning, had a chance to review things. We met with our LUPAC and the technical working group in the afternoon, and got a lot of really good feedback from both groups. I would say in particular, the LUPAC offered a lot of really good suggestions for the different areas and had a lot of good feedback. They clearly spent a lot of time looking at the draft, so we really appreciated that feedback. And I think, you know, I've gotten a little bit of feedback from your discussion yesterday morning, but I think our goal today was really just to kind of give you guys a chance to kind of ask questions about some of the bigger picture questions you maybe had and see what questions we can answer and things that you would like us to elaborate on or kind of clarify in the draft based on your review so far. And I understand, you know, some folks are probably deeper into it than others at this point.
Well, I think one of the things that came up that we kind of briefly touched on, and it's a very small issue, but when we're talking about land uses in some of the areas, there was a gentleman in the LUPAC that brought up a lot of additional uses that we hadn't thought of or aren't in the plan at this point, with the biking and running trails and things that are in multiple areas that we use, and they are starting to be a draw with some of the events that are held here in Park County. So I think that needs to be looked at probably in a lot of the areas, I guess, whether we do it overall or however you want to set that up. But that's one of the things that did come up. And I guess we need to talk about a little bit of a elephant in the room, being a few of the boundaries that really kind of came to light more so on the Clark area than the others, although the others, there's one or two others that have a little bit of concern. And I think in our discussion, it's more the type of land use in those areas and where it can be affected. And I'll use the Clark one as an example. Right now, the Clark area comes clear down to the city of Cody city limits, which does not make any sense to any of us that looked at it. Because there is definitely a difference in what can happen in that southern end of that area versus the actual Clark area. So we need to kind of look at that whole thing. And I'm not sure the best way to go about that, but we were going to set up a meeting with us and maybe a few of our people first part of January and take a look at what that would consist of to get those changed. And I understand there's some concern on your part, which makes sense because that could change a few of the numbers that show up in the plan. How significant that'll be, I don't know that we know yet until we know what areas we're really having concerns on. But I think we do need to take a look at that so that we can get it as accurate as we can. We don't want to have it just keep moving forward knowing that it's not the way it should be. So
A couple other things to just plant a seed on questions. I talked to Brian a little bit more just about the, you know, the mechanics of what that could look like and kind of, you know, things we need to be thinking about. And he reminded me that there are currently legal descriptions associated with the planning areas. So whether that, you know, we don't always have that in this sort of situation. So whether that needs to carry forward or not is something, you know, for you guys to think about. And then that the assessor data also ownership and subdivision specifically are associated with planning areas now. And so, you know, we would need some help from the county on that end to kind of update that data and whatnot. None of those are things that can't be overcome, but just things to keep in the back of our mind as we kind of talk through this.
okay, will do. What other thoughts do commissioners have from yesterday or from reading the plan? Excuse me.
Darcy, Madam Chair,
one thing, looking through it, it was kind of brought up a little bit yesterday as far as irrigation lands. I think I would, my concern is you gathered your information, I believe, based on irrigation districts as far as irrigated agriculture land in Park County. Is that correct?
There's two different layers. I think the question that came up yesterday pertained to the acreages we had associated with the actual irrigation districts. You're correct. But we do have other data already assembled that, kind of looks at the actual lands that are irrigated, whether I don't think that those two things are perfectly aligned. And so we need to go back and look to see whether, I think we can probably generate
That
a
was
number.
my concern, because there are literally thousands of acres in Park County that are not under a direct district or
Yep.
ditch company or anything like that. Okay,
We do have that information.
okay.
I guess in following up with that, we're looking at having an ag overlay. And I know Joy was working on that, and she's here, so this question's as much for her. As we look at that ag overlay, are all those lands that Lloyd is referring to that are irrigated, whether it's through a normal district or not, are those included in that ag overlay if they're being used that way?
So right now, the basis of the ag overlay is the USDA irrigated land list. That's the basis for it. Question is, how far out do you want to go? Because irrigation impacts land beyond its boundaries, obviously, hundreds of feet, sometimes the groundwater is impacted. And of course, those uses are surrounded by other things, so you might want to go beyond just irrigated land. But as far as these other irrigated areas, like because of canals and ditches and things like that, we didn't take that into consideration. Because we were just trying to correct the ag overlay we have now, which is absolutely not represented at all of the irrigated lands in our county. So if you want things added into consideration for the ag overlay, we absolutely can do that, but they need to be identified somehow. We need to know where they are and what you're talking about. Because again, we're just using that USDA irrigated lands layer as our basis. Finalize the ag overlay at this time, because we're gonna have to decide how thorough or how big we want it to be beyond that. So.
I think there's a little bit on that comes down to what the public wanted in the meetings that we went to. If they believe that some areas are irrigated ag, and we don't recognize those as irrigated ag, then we may have issues as we move forward with rules and regulations and what our thoughts are on how we're going to deal with ag lands. And so I guess we need to decide what that's going to look like, or where we want that to take effect.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I understand what Lloyd and others were talking about yesterday in terms of this area or these thousands of acres are not being included. Like, I need to see what he's talking about.
Okay.
Because I don't know what that is. That would not be part of the USDA layer. But I have the USDA layer. I have that data. We can bring it up and you can show me, where you're talking about.
Do you know if the USDA layer, only did the Bureau project? Or if they did,
Oh, no, it's private lands. It's.
well, but
No, no.
the Bureau project is the initial setup of irrigation systems in Park County from the reservoir. So I don't know if that's the information they had.
Yeah, it's not the irrigation system.
Okay.
It's just the land that water is applied to, is my understanding. So
Okay.
why there could be something missing, that's a bigger question, which we would have to probably call someone and find out. But if we want to enter the irrigation system infrastructure as a component of the overlay,
Yeah.
we have that data too.
Yeah.
So, I mean, but we would need to understand why and
Mhm.
what, so, I mean, we still need to kind of define what we want to be at, because it's big. I mean, it's gonna go from like 2 major polygons to huge areas across the county, which is not what it looks like now. So we have to be careful.
Yeah.
Take that broad brush, across the county.
I'm not sure we need to include the infrastructure. That wasn't where I was going. It was just what lands were they thinking about that they were using versus what's actually out there.
Right.
So Madam Chair, along those lines, when you were talking about irrigated lands from the USDA, is that including private ditches, or how are they collecting that data?
It's just the lands that are actually that have water, like croplands. That's what it is. It's irrigated cropland. It's not, I don't think it includes any like flooded rangeland or anything like that that I'm aware of. It's like literally the polygons are little isolated blobs on
Well,
top
that
of
is interesting.
fields that are
Mhm.
receiving water. And that's, which again is still more accurate than what we have now. So
Okay.
if we want to define ag as more than that, which is fine, we're gonna have to sit down and figure out what that's gonna be. Because I don't know that you have layers then. Now, we do have the assessors
Yes.
data
Mhm.
from the DOR that shows rangelands, wastelands, ag class lands, which would be another basis. But again, you now start to draw a much broader stroke across the county and you grow that area. And what is your intent? This is just like the wildland overlay. We can draw an overlay, but what do you intend to do within that area? What are you trying to achieve?
Right.
So.
Well, and I think that's the same conversation that came up with the North Fork yesterday in the LUPAC, talking about their ditch and their 100 users or however many there were. That might not be through the assessor's office because there is no assessment to that ditch. They pay dues to a particular group. So it's something that we may not have an accurate record of, but it's good hay land. I mean, it's considered ag land in a lot of people's mind.
Yeah, they actually would classify that. Because it's actually what it is occurring on the land.
Okay.
Like, it's the active use of the land.
Okay.
Which is what the classification is based on. So we would look at that and kind of see.
Okay, maybe we'll do a little bit more homework on that, Darcy,
Yeah.
before we get back together and see what the thoughts are.
And, you know, I think, back to your comment of Commissioner Overfield about, you know, just sort of the public weighing in on that. I think in an ideal scenario, we would have a, you know, a preliminary boundary that we could share. I think as Joy alluded to, we have a lot of different things we've talked about and, you know, kind of conceptual ideas. We just need to sort of pin down something to sort of put out there as a initial start and then see what sticks, I think, in terms of whether it needs to be bigger or smaller. But I think, you know, helping use this kind of final step in the process to vet that would be a good thing if we can make that happen.
Okay.
Madam Chair, what I was looking at was under the approximately page 63 and 64, under factors influencing growth, under irrigation, you're only listing the districts, and these overlays may change, but, and for instance, looking at the chart, the Clark is way off as far as number of acres. Is here, and like South Fork isn't even listed. So I know there's irrigation in Upper South Fork, a lot of ground.
Mhm.
So using these numbers it reflects like there's only that amount of irrigation in the factors for influencing growth. So that was my concern. Under that same section, like emergency services, it almost sounds like the only emergency services we have are Cody. If that's all that you have listed, there's actually, you only list and you talk about Fire District 2. There's a large Fire District 1 in Powell that covers all that. There's Fire District, I believe 6 is Clark. I'm not even sure. But you know, as far as law enforcement, the only, you know, sheriff is covers the whole county, but that paragraph about emergency services, I believe needs to be expanded.
Yeah, and I think I thought we had captured more of those in that section, but I think our hope is that your other departments and folks who work in these areas, you know, on a daily basis can kind of take a look and make sure we've got things accurately stated and all the information in there.
What else? Anything else come to mind from discussion yesterday?
Again, I did report to Darcy the full report of what we discussed, so that she could prepare for today in case she had any, if there were any major things that she was going to turn into a concern, because she's aware of, you know, technical things or the overarching news that you had any concerns on.
So a couple questions that I guess one thing that Joy had mentioned you guys were curious about that would be worth discussing as a group, I think, is, you know, the rationale for including the zoning recommendations, the regulatory updates in the implementation section. And, you know, I think from the beginning, we've kind of talked about this process, setting the stage for updates to the regulations. We've really emphasized that to the public. And so from our standpoint, it's, you know, it's part of being transparent with the public about when we say this plan will be implemented by the regulations, you know, future update, what will that mean? And also use the remainder of this process as a chance to kind of give you guys a head start and sort of test some of these concepts through this process now, so that when you get to the regulations, you have closure, hopefully close to closure on some of those directions for different areas. So in some cases, for example, in the planning areas, we've talked about different options. You know, there are a few spots where it's an if or, you know, an either or kind of proposition. And so I think we see the need to vet some of those ideas with the public and just, you know, kind of help them see where this might be going and see if we've, you know, what we've, in some cases, I think we've maybe taken a middle of the road approach in terms of suggesting potential changes to zoning, for example, of, you know, if we're going from 1 acres, we may be proposing going to 20 acres, you know, as a you know, kind of lot size instead of going the full step up to 35. And so, you know, we want to hear from the public about, you know, does that, and the property owners, frankly, about, you know, where do people kind of fall on these issues? And so having it in the plan, we think is important. I think as we noted in that section, the goal would be that it lives in that section until those things are actually in the regulations. And then once you've kind of adopted new regulations and moved past that, it could kind of fall off. And so I would see that as a little bit of a holding spot for these things that, you know, are kind of ongoing conversations that you'll be focused on. But it does, we think it's important to keep it in there for those reasons.
I also would add, Darcy, I think it influences the growth strategies, especially in some of the plan areas. And getting buy off on those would be really helpful because it might change the approach that the county might want to take, especially when it relates to ag preservation and things of those nature.
Let me ask Joy a little bit then about process. If we leave those in there, and I understand the reasons for them and getting the public input, certainly a little bit of angst, I guess, yesterday about having them in the permanent plan when we think about this thing sitting here for 8 to 10 to 20 years. What would be the process then as those get handled or the new regulations get done over the next year and a half? Would we then go back to this document and amend it to remove those things? Or what's the process so that those, we don't leave those as part of this forever? Because they could get confusing in the future if some of the things that are suggested in there aren't really what turns out to happen.
Well, I mean, Darcy, you can sort of speak to your experience, but you know, they're suggestions.
Mhm.
They are a way to implement the changes that the land use plan is communicating to the public. But you're not held to them. I mean, at the end of the day, what you adopt in your regulations is what you're going to choose to do. So
Okay.
is there harm in having things, suggestions in there that you don't implement? I guess that's perception, right? Like that someone may perceive that as harmful. But if it's just a plan, you know, they're going to give you all kinds of suggestions. They're going to suggest a transportation plan. They're going to suggest a housing study. They're going to suggest all of these different things. That doesn't mean you're going to go forward and do them like right now. You know, just like the land use plan in 1998 was like, hey, natural resource plan. It took 20 years to get that done too, right? So the implementation plan is, hey, here's how you actually take this thing and now make it work for you, you know, through regulations. But it doesn't mean you have to take every single thing and put it into effect. But it gives you the teeth to do it if and when you choose to do so. So, I mean, it's kind of like Darcy said, that we've been asking for the suggestions from the very beginning.
Mhm.
This is how they propose to deliver them, is in the implementation plan,
Okay.
part of the document, so.
Any other thoughts?
So I wanted to add a couple of other comments because they sort of came up in the technical working group and some other discussions yesterday. So on the matter of a transportation plan, really important that you factor in road development as part of your land development plans. Because as we discussed, there are costs related with improving roads and providing additional road service to other people in the county. And the county has a lot of existing right of ways that haven't been developed into roadways yet. And so the future for those. And so it is one of the proposed actions to consider developing a transportation plan for Park County, which also addresses how you match up with the city transportation arteries as well. The housing study issue is one that is kind of at the forefront of discussion with a lot of the economic partners right now. Housing is an issue in Park County. How that gets addressed from the county's perspective is certainly a big question. What role do we play in addressing housing concerns? But that is something that we haven't been able to answer very clearly because we don't have the right data to answer those questions. So housing is a concern. When we talk about modifying the planning area boundaries, a lot of those suggested changes that we've already talked about are coming because there's been development in those areas that now doesn't match those existing planning areas. The Cody local area has seen some expansion into the Sage Creek and north, and so we know where they're planning to expand. We would want to make sure that the Cody local boundaries represent where that growth has occurred or where we're expecting to see it. So when the counties are communicating to us right now, their expected expansion areas, we would certainly want our planning areas to probably fall in line with those. Same is true of Powell. We have some issues with our zoning and stuff on the east side of Powell that we really need to clean up. It could also potentially impact those planning area boundaries. And so when we have those planning area discussions, you know, Darcy cautioned us to be deliberate and make sure we're picking, we're changing the boundaries for a reason, not just because we feel like it. I think a lot of them are going to be very obvious though, just by even looking at aerial photography to see where that development has already occurred. We did talk about repetition in the document. We talked about that yesterday with Darcy a little bit. There are opportunities to clean some of that up. Some of it is just the message changes slightly depending on which goal you're under. So formatting of the document, probably see some changes. You asked for less pictures, maybe more less white space on some of the pages. So there was that. Make some changes to that. I'm just trying to think of some of the big topic areas that we brought up and I did talk to her about yesterday.
There was a suggestion to add a little bit more of the water info. I think Tony brought it up. We do have the single sheet in there, but the full study.
So we actually have both of those in there. I think that, you know, and that's one of those areas where, you know, we can pull as much of that technical information
Right.
into the body of the plan, but I think our rationale for leaving it in the appendix is it's going to change from you're going to want to update that, and you don't necessarily want to do a wholesale plan amendment just to do that. And so we tried to kind of tee it up and point to that so that people know that it's there, but you know, ultimately that's your choice.
Okay. I only saw the single page. I didn't see the other one. So, okay.
Yeah, there's that multi-page.
Okay.
More detailed one. So it was brought to my attention, and this is just an area where I don't have a lot of experience, and really the county doesn't either, but with improvement districts and service districts. So one of our, I don't know if it was a goal, but it talks about allowing individual or approving improvement districts for people. And I understand that there may be some law that prevents us from having special districts potentially. And that has not been shared with me yet, but I understand that there may be something at the state level that doesn't even allow us to implement special districts. And if that's true, that's kind of a big deal, because we of course don't want to be communicating that we want to encourage them when you're not even allowed to approve them. But the reason this is important is because of Ralston in particular, and I'll just talk about Ralston over and over again, because Ralston has very small lot sizes. They are basically maxed out on their Northwest Rural Water capability right now. And they are going to run into a situation where people are not going to be able to put in or repair their septic systems because they cannot meet today's rules for the water and septic offsets, which means I'm going to have to start telling people, no, you know, you can't do A, B, or C, which can sometimes mean you can't even have a house, which obviously is not what anybody wants. So one of the things we're trying to evaluate is how we're all seem to go about getting some sort of service district or improvement district to improve the water system or have a central sewer system or something that would allow that community to function as a town site, which is how it was platted. But it's not incorporated. So those are tricky questions that I'm not sure we can answer. But I just want to make sure that if we have language in our plan suggesting improvement districts or service districts, that we can even implement them. So I am following up with the individual who told me that we can't do that, to say, hey, I need to see legit language in the statutes or somewhere that says that we cannot do that. And it may be that it's because you have to be incorporated. I really don't know. We do have some districts in Park County, individual uses that had come before you years ago for water improvement district or, right? And I don't know the evidence that was used to execute those. But I do think it's worth looking into. I did ask the attorney's office to help with that subject, but they're absolutely packed as well as we are. So that's just something I'm concerned about, is the improvement, because honestly, I see that as a really nice potential tool to help some of these folks who do have dense development, maybe having water and sewer problems, to give them an option financially to get those improvements that they need. But if we can't do it, then I don't want to be prescribing it. So that's kind of a little hiccup that we need to work through as well.
Okay.
But otherwise, the plan has been positively received so far by the technical working group, the LUPAC and you as well. Generally speaking, it reads well, and it is reflecting what the public has told us. I mean, we are seeing the words that we were hearing at all of the public meetings and surveys, so. We're really hoping that the public will take the time to at least look at their section that applies to their planning area, because ultimately those guidelines are what you are going to use to rewrite the regulations for Park County, which ultimately means what you can and cannot do in your planning area. So it's super important, once this public version hits the road, that people take it seriously.
Excuse me. How do we feel, how are we moving forward, Darcy? I know our original timeline has a few hiccups, and especially if we do a little bit of boundary changing, that's going to affect things somewhat. Are we talking a couple weeks? Are we talking a month or two? Or do you have any concept of where we think we might be if we look at these changes, and what for the public to expect?
I think my hope would be that we can keep the momentum going as much as we can. I think we've pushed really hard to get to this point in this timeline. I think thinking back after we delivered the draft and we started in February, it was like, wow, that was a fast ride. So I think it was fast coming together. And I think, as you all noted, there it feels that way in a few cases, and we've got some work to do to polish things up. But I think nothing that I've heard so far, with the exception of the planning area adjustments, gives me great heartburn in terms of kind of sticking with our timeline. I think, if we have the ability to kind of jump in and start working on the stuff we're already aware of, as soon as that the deadline passes on the 6th, then we should be in kind of a good situation to talk about those other changes. So I don't know that I want to kind of nail that down today, but I'm hoping that we wouldn't have to push the meetings back by more than a couple of weeks. But maybe we can talk about that on our call this week and try to nail something down. I think it's important that we do, just if we're not going to stick to that date, we need to kind of nail down what it's going to be ASAP and make sure everybody's kind of got that on their radar.
Okay, thank you. Any
One
other?
thing, Madam Chair, so we've been getting a lot of questions about the wildlife overlay. We've gotten questions from the public, we've gotten questions from the LUPAC, what is the deal on the wildlife overlay? And so, as you know, we've had meetings with Game and Fish and some other entities to discuss where are these high value wildlife use areas, so to speak. And we do have a sense now from a map that we can identify where those high value areas are. The question will remain, what is the county going to want to do in those areas, which would ultimately become a wildlife overlay for Park County. there are some people who think that means you're gonna just be like, you're not allowed to do anything in those areas, and I just want to make it clear on the record that that's not the intent. That's not been discussed, that's not even the goal of the wildlife overlay. The goal of the wildlife overlay right now is identifying those high value areas where we probably want to do an extension of education to the public about what they're doing on their land, where the wildlife are using it, you know, and they're greatly benefiting from it. That doesn't mean you're not going to be able to build potentially, or you're not going to be able to do ABC on your property. It just means we need to do more outreach, and who's going to do that outreach is sort of part of the question right now. So just wanted to put that out there because people seem to think that a wildlife overlay means we're dead in the water. That has absolutely not been discussed at all. In fact, that is opposite of what's being discussed. So we haven't finalized that yet, but those discussions, you know, remain. And I do think that that's going to be an important part of the plan, is just educating the public about how valuable their property may be, you know, to those wildlife resources, which are a huge value to Park County. So just want to put that out there to clarify for folks.
And I think we talked a little bit about a process where when applications come in areas that appear on the map to be pretty substantial, that there would be a little bit more of an education process, maybe some documents from that Game and Fish can help put together, or at least a review, so that it is an educational process, not
Yeah.
necessarily to stop anything.
Yeah, and there are very big independent pushes right now outside of the county, but it's not under our purview, but there's very big push to educate people about conservation easements, land trusts. You know, ways that you can protect lands in perpetuity to keep them for wildlife use and open space. But that's not something that the county is necessarily pushing. We're just, it's more of an education tool to let people know that those options do exist.
When do we have a schedule or a thought process from the Game and Fish as to when we'll see? I know they were gonna work on that map a little bit more to make sure they had covered what they wanted to cover. Do we have any kind of info from them on a?
You know, the last I heard, I had another request for the latest parcel there just on Friday, which has been out to them right away. I haven't heard any decision timeline as far as their goal and education and inspection type stuff, but
Okay.
no, I haven't had anything new.
Madam Chairman?
Yes.
If I may, just, I guess, one more thing we haven't touched on today, just to make sure it's on everyone's mind, that, you know, is still outstanding as well, is the kind of the details around the cities in terms of the coordinated planning areas. So
Mhm.
we had met individually with Matitsi, Powell, and Cody, you know, kind of leading right up to when we delivered the draft. So we basically said we would leave a placeholder for those maps until we had a chance to vet them with, you know, vet the ideas and kind of what we heard with
Mhm.
you and with them, before that kind of makes its way into the draft. And so we have some preliminary ideas on our end that we're looking at, that we will get to you guys and kind of keep that conversation going. But I think we've been happy to have their cooperation and, you know, kind of participation in the process. But that is you know, what's keeping us from releasing essentially the map portal for the future land use map is, you know, that's kind of a key component of that we need to work through over the coming weeks.
Yeah, and I know there have been a lot of questions about sort of joint discussions with the cities and that 1 mile buffer around the cities. And everybody on the team and most people who do the work that they do within the cities understand that it's not the city's intent to grow to this perfect 1 mile buffer outside of their boundary. In fact, there are whole directions outside of the cities that they're not even looking at for various reasons, topographical challenges, just can't get their utilities out that way. So the public needs to understand that there isn't going to be this magic half-mile zone or 1 mile zone where we're going to be talking about intergovernmental discussion. We're really going to be focusing on those areas where the cities actually do intend to grow, where it makes sense to grow. And we're going to make our zoning speak to that as well. You know, we don't want to be putting urban type development plans where there's absolutely no way the city can even grow in that direction. That absolutely makes no sense. And right now, that's a little bit of what we have in several areas. So we do intend to really focus on these planned expansion areas and have bigger discussions with the cities about how should we be planning development in those areas. Should those developers be doing something to bring them closer to the city standards so that those things will match up well with the city when they're annexed in the future? And so those are discussions that are being had right now with the cities as to, we're not gonna come to agreement, obviously, with this process. But I do see there could be some discussions in the future about those joint agreements for those areas.
Makes sense. Anything else come to mind today?
Madam Chair, just your planning and zoning group, they're gonna comment and also coming up, could we also see what those comments are
Yeah.
out of your group?
So we have a statutory responsibility to bring this plan up through the Planning and Zoning Commission. And so their review will start tomorrow. So their discussion about the review anyway will begin tomorrow. And then, of course, when the plan comes out to the public, the first adoption hearing will go through the Planning and Zoning Commission. And so the public will have at least 2 opportunities during public hearings. And that's all after the next set of public meetings that we'll be holding. So there's still a lot coming for the public. But the Planning and Zoning Commission necessarily will be the ones to bring the recommendation forward about the final adoption draft to you. So,
Anything else? Anything else from your end, Darcy?
Nope.
Okay. Well, thank you. Like we said, it's well-received first draft.
Thank you for your time. We'll look forward to continuing the conversation. Speak to you guys soon.
All right, thank you. Longer break than we figured on, but we don't